So there are four types of targets, I think, generally that Israel can go after them through military strikes. First is the nuclear sites. One thing that we should know is that right now that the regime knows its missile program really does not provide any deterrence, I think it is more eager to go after the nuclear bomb. It doesn't matter what they say in the short term. In the short term, maybe they say, okay, let's negotiate because they are in a very weak position now. But after what we saw, after everyone knows how weak the regime is now, they need that bomb. Their whole missile program is worth nothing if they don't have the bomb. So they will go after the bomb. So that means Israel also is more eager, given that the regime wants to destroy Israel, to get rid of their nuclear program. So one target is the nuclear facilities.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. And today, in a very timely manner, joins me Saeed Ghasseminejad. Saeed, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's getting very tense in the Middle East, more and more. And even though we're almost a year into what you could say the biggest segment of the Israel-Palestinian war that we're witnessing, almost October 7th. On the time of recording, we're 1 week away. We've witnessed this week a huge situation unfolding in the Middle East. Iran launching more than 180 rockets into Israel. We've seen the U.S. also intercept some of the rockets. Some of the rockets did fall. But I would like to hear your first thoughts into all of this situation that has unfolded. What did you see, and how does this change the whole situation in the Middle East between Israel and Iran?
Just need to say this is the morning of October 2nd, so the situation is pretty fluid, so things can change. I think we have to see everything that's happening in the context of the post-October 7 situation. So after October 7, I think Israel managed to release itself partially from the shackles that had been put on Israel by the West, mostly by the United States. So for many years, Israel really did not respond forcefully to what the Islamic regime in Iran and its proxies have been doing. Every time Israel tried to go after these proxies, there has been pressure from outside, mainly from the US, and it was bipartisan, like Bush did it, Obama did it. And these proxies actually managed to become stronger and stronger. So in the post-October 7, the situation has changed to a certain degree. So Israel has decimated Hamas to a good degree. That's what it seems. It doesn't mean Hamas has been destroyed. It means that in the short term, Hamas does not have the capacity that it had. Then you had the April event when Tehran launched hundreds of missiles and drones into Israel. And the lesson we learned from that was that actually Tehran's missile program really didn't work very well. So the deterrence that Tehran thought it had and everyone else thought it had really didn't work. And then Israel managed to target a high-value strategic target deep inside the Iranian soil. So that showed that Iran actually doesn't have a good air defense either. Then we had this Hezbollah thing. So for a week, Israel managed to decapitate Hezbollah. The leadership is gone. And before that, through the pager operation, it managed to weaken Hezbollah. We can assume that those who had the pagers were the elite force of the Hezbollah, were the top people at the middle rank, but the top people in the middle rank. And Hezbollah really didn't manage to respond in any effective way. And Hezbollah is basically Iran's defense against an Israeli attack deep into the Iranian soil. So the missile program that Iran had doesn't work. Their air defense doesn't work. Hezbollah doesn't work. Hamas is mostly gone. So they had to do something. There was tons of pressure from their proxies, from within the rank, and they felt also that they lost the deterrence. So this time, I think these were the best probably they could do. We have to still wait, missiles experts tell us. I have a good friend, Behnam Ben Taleb, who is really one of the best missile experts. So they will tell us what was launched into Israel. But based on what we saw so far, is that these were much more sophisticated than the previous one. These were ballistic missiles, so the time to react was lower. And still, it seems that they really didn't do any strategic damage. So maybe they hit here and there, this building or that building, but it doesn't seem they managed to target any strategic target. So the deterrence is not restored. So that's where we are now. The regime, I think, it is still in a strategic impasse. And now Israel has the opportunity to go after the regime. So last time the United States managed to, put pressure on Israel, make sure it doesn't do a significant response. This time we have to see. Hopefully Israel, resist against the pressure this time and use this opportunity to do something more. We can go into what type of targets Israel can go after if you want.
Yes. No, so that would be wonderful. Yes. That was actually my question. The opportunity in itself. What does this mean for Israel? How can they take advantage of the opportunity? Where do you see them strategically make the best out of the situation?
So there are 4 types of targets, I think, generally that Israel can go after them through military strikes. There are like other cyber things that, Israel has a much wider options. But if we just focus on the military part, so first is the nuclear sites. So one thing that we should know is that right now that the regime knows its missile program really does not provide any deterrence, I think it is more eager to go after the nuclear bomb. It doesn't matter what they say in the short term. In the short term, maybe they say, okay, let's negotiate, because they are in a very big position now. But after what we saw, after everyone knows how weak the regime is now, they need that bomb. Their whole missile program is worth nothing if they don't have the bomb. So they will go after the bomb. So that means Israel also is more eager, given that the regime wants to destroy Israel, to get rid of their nuclear program. So one target is the nuclear facilities. That's a very complex subject in terms of political consequences, in terms of environmental consequences, and in terms of feasibility. Because if you talk to military experts, they are not sure that Israel, as it is, with the capacity that it has now, can actually, destroy the nuclear program or not. And by destroy, I don't mean that the regime cannot rebuild it, but setting it back for a few years. So that's what we always talk about, because the regime has the expertise, has the technology, and this is a very old technology, it's not a very sophisticated thing. So that's one option. The second option is the military infrastructure of the regime. So this includes IRGC headquarters, IRGC sites, the missile production and storage, the weapon production and storage, the defense ministry, things like that, and their officials, like top IRGC officials, top defense ministry officials, Israel can go after them. The third option is the political target, like the Supreme Leader's office, Supreme Leader himself, Presidential Palace, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, which is partially responsible for all this terrorism around the borders and Israel, the Majlis. So these are political targets that Israel can go after. And then the fourth one is the industrial infrastructure, like the oil and gas production, refineries, transfer facilities, the petrochemical plants, the industrial metal production facilities. So if you go after these three types of facilities, oil and gas, industrial metal, and petrochemical, we are talking about 80% of Iran's export. And this is really the backbone of the GDP. So half of GDP, like any other country, comes from the service. But the part that actually produces the hard currency that economy needs as its fuel comes from these three industries that I talked. So these are four targets. Then you have like the cyber operation, really can go after a lot of targets there. But which one of these targets Israel wants to go after, I think it depends on what policy Israel has for the day after. I really don't see, so Israel can degrade the regime, but the solution is really regime change. Because as I said, making a nuclear bomb, it's not a very difficult thing, like technologically, especially for Iran, which is a large country. It has tons of human resources, tons of natural resources, has a lot of neighbors. It's difficult to enforce sanctions in a way that, they don't have that resources. We always can enforce sanctions in a way that the resources that they have is reduced. But if they are really adamant to go after the nuclear bomb, over time they can rebuild that program. And we know that they are adamant to go after the nuclear bomb. Their whole foreign policy, their whole domestic policy is built around destroying Israel because this is an ideological regime. So the solution comes from whatever you do now, you need to have a policy for the day after to make sure that this regime falls in a, reasonable window of time. And I think that comes from what we at FDD has described as maximum pressure on the regime and maximum support for the Iranian people. So they can actually bring down this regime, and that's, I think, possible. It's possible more than any time these days because the regime is really weakened. I think Israel really became a mythbuster here. There was a lot of talk about how strong the regime is, how strong its proxies are. We saw that they are not.
Wow. So there's a lot to cover there. I would like to discuss later on the key sentence you just said, the day after, what happens the day after. But before that, I'm wondering, Saeed, it seems that the conflict between Iran and Israel was initially first, through speeches. We would see both sides of the coin mentioned, like Iran is a threat, Israel is a threat, and so on. Then it escalated towards becoming an armed proxy war, meaning Iran would act through Hezbollah and Hamas and other proxies, and Israel already, like you said, has dismantled most of Hamas capabilities and is working right now with Hezbollah in the North Front. So my question here is, has the conflict changed towards a direct confrontation between the Iran regime, and Israel? Because we've seen, like you said before, two waves of ballistic missiles back in April, and now this week happen directly between Iran and Israel. And now, is it safe to say that this is just it's already a war between Iran and Israel directly? Is it safe to assume that, Saeed?
But they are not neighbors. So whatever war they're going to have, without if you don't consider the proxies, will be through missiles and Air Force. But the war is not. So this is something that the regime in Iran has been planning for a long time, and this is something that when the Shah of Iran was toppled by an alliance of the left and Islamists, the first important foreign person who came to Iran was Yasser Arafat. And he was embraced by all factions of the new regime, from the Khomeinis to the backer of Mohammad Mossadegh to the Fedayeen, which was a Marxist-Leninist organization, to the Mujahideen Khalq, which was an Islamist Marxist organization. So all of them, embraced Arafat. And if you go and read about the history of that revolution, the Palestinian group really helped this, especially the armed groups like the Mujahideen Khalq, the Fedayeen. A lot of them fought alongside these Palestinian groups against Israel. So they are very, this anti-Israeli policy, this Palestine-centric policy has been in the DNA of that Marxist and Islamist alliance that brought in this regime. So this is something that they had in mind for a long, long time, and they have been planning for it. If you look at their foreign policy, why are they in Lebanon like this? Why are they in Gaza, investing? What are they doing in Jordan? Iran doesn't have any border with Jordan. What are they doing in Yemen to be able to blockade the Red Sea corridor? And it's not just Israel. The second option is Saudi Arabia. So they want Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem. So these are the three. These three cities have very important ideological value to them, because the regime sees itself as the representative of the God on earth, representative of the hidden Imam. This is the 12th Imam who is hidden. He will come back to bring the end of the time. And Khamenei, as Wali Faqih, his main task is to lay the ground for the reappearance of the hidden Imam. For the Western audience, this may sound like, lots of gibberish, but from their point of view, this is quite real. So they live in this, they live in this context. If you actually listen to them, they are talking constantly about things that happened 1400 years ago. That's not what you hear in the West. You don't see, for example, the presidential candidate here in the US constantly talk about what Jesus would do and what the apostle would do, talking about events that happened 2000 years ago constantly. They are talking about it. They are thinking about thinking in that context. So, right. So we are seeing a more and more direct war because the regime feels it has the capacity, it has the means to engage in that right now. So they actually managed to, force the Saudis into some kind of detente that's beneficial to the regime. And they thought that they have, they had enough power. They feel more and more, they feel they are stronger, so they can actually engage in this back and forth with Israel. And one reason that they had this feeling, which is, I think, it's a false feeling, is that every time they went up this ladder of tension, the Americans backed off. So Israel is not the only country that when the regime increases the tension, Israel doesn't back off anymore. Israel increases the tension too. And we will see what happens. I think when you do that, after a time, when they try, the regime will back off.
It seems that we're on a tit-for-tat scenario. Every time one regime, well, Iran's regime answers back, Israel fires back, and so on and so forth. And here, this is a curiosity that emerges from listening to you, Saeed, is that are the leaders in Iran, you mentioned the myth-busting situation that just unfolded for Iran, but on their perspective, you also mentioned that they believe they're the strongest now to start their offensive against Israel and against Saudi Arabia.
They entered into this conflict feeling emboldened and strong. I think they now understand they are in a strategic impasse, but they don't have because the only way they know how to get out of this is to create more tension. That's what they have done with the US every time, and they managed to win. So now they are using the same model on Israel now. So if Israel backs off, they will win. If Israel does not back off, I think they will finally find out that they are losing. Because if you look at the fundamental, this is a very weak regime. Militarily, economically, domestically, it's weak. But it has really mastered the art of bluffing. And because we in the West really don't have a lot of strong leaders anymore, so they have managed to win. If you if you respond strongly, they will back up with you.
So backing out will be part of Iran's side, not Israel's side, and that means. But how do the external powers, meaning the West, but also specifically the United States, but on the other hand, Russia also has ties with Iran's regime. So it's just, for me, listening to you firsthand is just surprising to hear, because, like you say, they were great at bluffing. I fell under that bluff. I thought they were very, very strong. But how would this influence or affect Russia's also influence in the region with Iran? I think also Russia they have their own war right now too, but they were also, and correct me if I'm wrong, they were also feeding Iran's regime with military capabilities, arms, missiles. So was this all just a stunt? Was this all just, try to show force through talk? But actually, if we were into an all-out war, quote-unquote, like you say, an all-out war between Israel and Iran would be taking into consideration the proxies, because they're not neighbors, but it would be missiles, it would be air force. So it would, from the impression I'm getting, is Israel, if it does decide to go and really create a serious offensive, striking the four pillars that you just mentioned, it seems as though the regime would collapse very rapidly. And so what would happen here also with Russia and the United States, all of this equation?
I think the regime is counting on winning the war of attrition, because so Israel, it's a smaller country. It has a very developed economy, but its developed economy depends on having security, having ties with the rest of the world. So I think the regime in Iran counts on, this war of attrition, that Israelis get tired, that the Americans get tired, because Israel, if it wants to get into a serious offensive, it needs over time U.S. support, U.S. military support, not military intervention, but getting the weapons that it needs. So I think that's what the regime counts on. But let me talk about it from U.S. perspective, how I think U.S. should see. So U.S. is the global hegemon, global superpower. As a global hegemon, what you want to do, the first task that you need to do is to make sure that unfriendly regional hegemon do not rise. Because if these unfriendly regional hegemons rise, they can replace you. So we now have in 3 areas of the world, 3 unfriendly regional hegemons rising: China, Russia, Iran. And even worse than that, they are in an axis. A lot of people talking like this is a very uncomfortable axis, and they are right. But if you look at the World War II, the Second World War, that was also very uncomfortable axis. Like Japan had a truce with Soviet Union, while Germany and Soviet Union were at war with each other. Same thing with Germany and Italy. They had a lot of tensions together. So we are seeing a global anti-American axis rising. And the weakest one here is the regime in Iran. Its economy is very fragile. Its security and intelligence establishment has been deeply penetrated by Israel. Its proxies have been shattered. It's in war with its own people. Over the last 6 years, there have been 3 really widespread uprising protests, each time protests in more than 150 cities. So this is a regime that's the weakest link here. And you have an ally here in Israel. You have your partners like Saudi Arabia, UAE. They all have an unfriendly relation with Iran. They're afraid of the regime, but they don't like it. So, and I think this is an opportunity for the United States to say, okay, I'm going to solve this problem in the Middle East. And if I solve this problem in the Middle East, if you have the regime in Iran gone, replace it with a normal regime, then you can get, this is where China gets 50% of its oil. So then you have Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, all of them will be pro-US. So you secure Middle East. A lot of your troops, you can move them from that region either to Eastern Europe or to East Asia, which is the most important area for you. So that's, I think, from the US perspective, should be no-brainer, especially because we are talking, there is a lot of talk about pivot to Asia, but when you have this global access, if you get out of Middle East, so what happens? It's that Iran, China, and Russia will dominate Middle East. We see that already in the southern part of the Persian Gulf, like Saudi Arabia, UAE. They are having this very dubious relationship with all sides now. They are hedging, all because they are quite afraid of the regime in Iran. And I think this is really an opportunity for the United States to have a policy of regime change again. I'm not talking about an invasion of Iran by the United States. I'm talking about having solving the nuclear program, delaying it, and then you have a policy of max pressure, max support to bring down the regime. So then you can focus on the 2 other unfriendly hegemons that you have, which are Russia and China.
I think it's not to get very political. I think it's just important due to the context that we're living in. We're just 1 month away from the presidential election in the U.S. And when I hear you, it sounds like, the Situation Room in the White House is considering this equation of, maybe we can dismantle Iran, have it as an ally, and then move on to Asia and Eastern Europe, like you say. Here, my concern is in the United States, there's such a dissonance, at least in the public eyes, and also some of the rhetorical speeches or just normal speeches by the White House, and also I think less in terms of the presidential Republican candidate Donald Trump, less rhetorical against Israel. Kamala Harris has expressed support, and I think Sullivan, who's also I think the security advisor, I'm probably botching it, but Sullivan just said yesterday after the attacks that the United States will support head-on Israel. But here the dissonance, Saeed, is the White House thinking about this in the right way? Is the public also thinking about this in the right way? What is the disconnect? Because the message that we're hearing is not the same as the one that you are referring to, that says Iran, the Iranian regime, to be specific, not Iran in its whole, is right now the threat that we need to face. But instead we're listening, chants against Israel, against the United States, against the West strategy. So if I'm making sense, Saeed, how can we tie all of this together in a presidential election? And how does this influence, the whole strategy that the United States should take?
So what I'm saying, it's a long-term strategy. So if you look at it in the short term through the lens of the presidential election, so we have a problem in the Democratic Party. So you have a progressive wing, which is quite anti-Israel. You see it in the polls. It's not new. It has been like this for a few years. So when you look at the polls in the Democratic Party, usually support for Israel and Palestine, it's around the same number. So that's a big enough of constituency that they have to, to address it. So that number goes up and down, but there is a big enough constituency there. So and then you have an Obama doctrine for the Middle East, which says, so we have to get out, and then our allies and the regime in Iran, they have to somehow, divide the region between themselves. So that was, I think, what Obama said in his, maybe Obama said, or his advisor, I have to, but in that famous interview with Atlantic. So that's a very problematic view about Middle East, because and then you had like the John Kerry type of naive opinion that if we give enough money to the mullah and bring them to the international community, they somehow become moderate and will not be Islamist anymore. They can be managed. I think that's really a post-religious, post-ideology view of the world that a lot of Western politicians have. We had the same hope about China. So basically, the West opens its door to China, hoping that when they become rich, they won't be communist anymore. They will turn into some kind of liberal democracy. And it didn't happen like that. They are still, illiberal. They're still communist, and they're still very much anti-West. So it's just that they are much richer and much more powerful. Same formula will not work with the regime, because the communism is a new religion. Islam is a much older religion, much deeper into the psyche of human beings. So the idea that these people, if they get rich so they won't be Islamist anymore. It's just so ridiculous. But because a lot of Western politicians are not religious anymore, I think they really don't. It's very strange to them that these people can be serious about these facts. So, but in the long term, I think we need to, if we want to have, if the U.S. wants to keep its position as the global hegemon, really needs to look at it through this lens, that there are these unfriendly regional hegemons, and we need to get rid of them. That's what you see in history all the time. So if you don't do that, they are going to replace you. So I really don't see any other way. And I think there are, like, in that part of Democratic Party understands that, part of Republican Party understands that, and Republican Party more, obviously. And I think I hope that as time passes, that will be resolved. But I think our allies like Israel, they should do what's good for them. So Israel is obviously, it's a close ally. It depends on us on lots of things, especially on, the military support. But at the end, it should do what's good for them. Not what's good for a presidential candidate because at the end, if Israel is under serious threat, none of these Western politicians are coming to help. They may send their prayers, but they are not coming to defend Israel. The Israelis should defend themselves.
Yeah, it's a great point, Saeed. And going deeper into the dissonance here in the United States of the conflict, the discerning opinions, not only in the White House but in the public as a whole, I would love to hear or for you to shed a light on the social reality that's in Iran with this regime, the human rights. How are these how are these really unfolding, and how are they contrasting in terms of the West, on the values of the West? Just because I think it's important for our listeners to understand, and for myself too, to understand truly the social fabric of Iran within embedded in this regime's control.
So the regime has the backing of a minority of the population now. So you have had several rounds of boycotting of the election over the past few years, even by the regime's own statistic, which is always, trumped up numbers. The majority of people have boycotted the elections over the last few years. You have had 3 waves of widespread protest over the last few years. Each time, because at FTD we track them, each time it has been in more than 150 cities and towns. Each time the regime, if you look at the number of people which have been killed in this protest, you have thousands of people who have been killed, thousands who have lost their eyes because they have been shooting people in the eye. You have had tens of thousands of people who have been arrested, tortured. So the regime really used a very violent response to be able to stay in power. So the only thing that right now saves the regime is its oppression machine. And for example, on the issue of hijab, you see that majority of people, even in their own polling, sometimes they publish it. Their own polling show that people don't want the Sharia to be imposed on them. But the regime has to do it because, again, this is it in its DNA. And what keeps it in power, it's this oppression machine that in this oppression machine, you have these radical Islamists. So if it accepts some reforms, then it will, it cannot stay as it is. because then that oppression machine won't be the same as before. Yes, you will have people who get money to oppress people, but those who get some money to oppress people, they are not going to risk their life. Those who are risking their lives are the radical Islamists. So it has a very narrow base now. The base is getting narrower and narrower. So that's why I'm saying it's in a very weak position now. You have a majority of people who don't like the people, who don't like the regime. It doesn't mean all of them are coming to street, because coming to street in Iran means getting killed, getting shot, getting tortured, getting being sent to prison. So, but still, like each time you see, you have, I think our estimate is that the last time you had a few 100,000 people coming to street across the country. But the moment that this oppression machine shows the slightest sign of weakness, you will see millions of people coming. And that's the time that the dam will break and the regime will fall. So I think that's what we really need to work on again. We need to maximize the pressure on the regime and maximize the support for the people. And really, the U.S. government hasn't done that. So I'm an economist. One of the things I do is to follow the sanctions enforcement. And right now, Iran is exporting around 1.7 million barrels of oil. So before sanction, that was like 2.4, 2.5. So it's very close to its pre-sanction number for the oil export. Since Biden took power, Iran has exported like $122 billion of oil, and I'm considering it with the 15% discount to Brent. So it's not a full price, discount price, which I think is realistic. But that's $122 billion just for oil. And you look at the non-oil export, it was actually, over the last few years, it has been the highest number of their non-oil export in their history. So the Biden administration, for whatever reason, they thought, we are not enforcing they have an unwritten deal with the regime that we are not enforcing the sanctions. You don't make the bomb when we are in the White House. I think that's the deal they have right now, because it doesn't make any sense that they really don't enforce any sanction. And so, where did this money go? This money went to the Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis in Yemen, to all these proxies in Iraq and Syria, and to this oppression machine inside Iran, which is keeping the regime in power. If you don't, as I said, so their oppression machine now has two parts. There's a very small part. These are the committed one, the radical Islamists. And then it has a bigger part. These are the ones that who are getting paid to go and beat people, to go and kill people. So these are being, if you don't have the money to pay them enough that they go and kill people. So this part of the oppression machine will not be involved. So that's why you need max pressure on them. So to have them weaker and weaker, so the next time that people come to street, the regime can actually collapse.
Wow, that was a masterclass there, Saeed. Thank you for those insights. A lot of questions emerge. First of all, what you mentioned on the social protests in Iran, it just reminded me of Timur Kuran's pulse preference. People who don't really share their political preferences due to political fears, like you said, it makes sense. And going deeper into the situation with the oil and how the sanctions are not being enforced, and that what you mentioned, that perhaps this is just like a quid pro quo, you could say. We won't enforce sanctions for you not to develop the bomb. I remember that you said during our conversation that 50% of the oil that China receives comes from Iran, correct? Or did I...
50% of the oil that China receives comes from the Persian Gulf.
The Persian Gulf. So, supposing that Trump is a big fan of sanctions, he always says it in his speeches. Supposing that they do enforce the sanctions here, how would that cast a ripple effect? In Iran, we were saying maximize pressure, but how would that affect the entirety of the supply chain of oil? And how would that make perhaps China move their pieces of the puzzle? Economically speaking, it would affect Iran, but also China in a sense. So how do you see this also playing out?
Look, so Iran is selling like 1.7 million barrel of oil. It's not a lot in the oil market anymore. There are like others who can replace that. So at some point, we actually, the Saudis and Emiratis and other partners worked with China to replace that oil. So it can happen again. But you need to impose pressure, impose a cost. So these Chinese companies decide, okay, we are going to buy from the Saudis, not from the Iranians. Because so they are buying it cheaper, obviously. And China is also, it's not just an economic decision for China. It is trying to keep afloat a partner that China is using to erode the American power in the Middle East. So there is also some kind of political decision there. So you need to impose cost on them. So, for example, right now, all the sanctions that we have on this network of, companies that are transferring the Iranian oil to China, most of them are on front companies. Treasury recently started to go after the tankers, which is a good move. But what you need to do, you need to go after the refineries in China that are buying this oil and using it, and the banks in China, the ultimate bank that's actually transferring this money, which is the People Bank of China. So you need to go and impose some costs there. So the China decides that, okay, I'm not going to buy it from Iran. I'm going to buy it from another country. If we want to be more creative, there are other ways to do it. So we have these sanctions. You can actually confiscate these tankers. So that will actually increase the risk a lot more. We can confiscate these sanctions, sell the oil. So if you sell the oil, it actually helps the market too, because, that oil will not leave the market. Then the United States can use that revenue. This actually happened 1 or 2 times, but it wasn't going to China. It was going to Venezuela. So you can then use that revenue to fund the second part of the strategy that we talked about, the maximum support. So this way, this way you will have this oil coming into the market, and you can actually fund your strategy using that oil. The regime will obviously retaliate, will try to retaliate. We have seen that. Then there you need to show some strength. That would be a good opportunity to get rid of the Navy. We have done it before during at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. So the IRGC was going after tankers, and the United States started sinking the IRGC Navy, and then they stopped doing that.
Saeed, we've discussed the overview of the whole war, the implications.
Before, can I say something? So a lot of us were worried about what happens to the energy market if Israel and Hezbollah get into a war. And because Hezbollah and the proxies in Syria could actually target the, I hope I'm saying the English pronunciation right, the Ceyhan port. which is taking the oil from Azerbaijan and Iraq to Turkey, from there to Europe, the Houthis could actually blockade the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. The Iranian and the Iraqis could actually blockade the Persian Gulf. None of that happened. So a lot of this, thinking that, oh, what happens if we do something? This regime can do this, and that. A lot of it is, I think, is hyped up. So if they see a strong response, they will back off. They are ideological, but they're also pragmatist. Their goal is quite crazy, but they are pragmatist in how they want to arrive there. So if they see the might of the United States Navy and Army and Air Force, they will back off. The problem is that they don't see that.
Yeah, it seems that we're getting closer to that scenario where they will see it one way or another, hopefully, in a sense that, perhaps the new administration, if Donald Trump wins, maybe he will enforce that. On the other hand, we've also heard the White House kind of implying that, but again, they haven't shown it, like you say. Right now, what we've just seen is just some interceptions, missile interceptions from the U.S. For example, yesterday, they helped intercepting some of the ballistic missiles coming from Iran. So maybe we will see that, and maybe we'll test that theory that, Iran will back off. Saeed, as we begin to wrap up, I would like to discuss the day after that we mentioned previously. How does the day after look like, after the war, after maybe an Israeli offensive, after the U.S. shows its might, military might? How does it look like for Iran's future, the Middle East's future, and the conflict as a whole for you?
I think it depends on, if we are talking about the short-term conflict that we are seeing, it depends on which targets are going to, be decimated or not. So if you have like the infrastructure, I think it would be very difficult for Iran to rebuild them, especially if we decide to really enforce our sanctions. For example, if you take off the Hark terminal, a lot of Iran's oil exports goes through that. So rebuilding that will take a long time. So that would be basically a sanction enforcement mechanism that will be will be in place for a long time. If you go after the petrochemical plants, I think Iran is exporting $15 million per year there. So that would be difficult to rebuild there. So it really depends on which type of target you are going after. So if you go after like the leadership, I think that it's very difficult to predict what will happen, but that will definitely weaken the regime a lot. So if you see like what happened with Hezbollah, Hezbollah, they have their weapons now, but the leadership is not there. So it really depends on what type of target Israel is going after, and whether they have the will to build on that. But what we all need to want, I think, is for this regime to be gone. Because before this Islamic Revolution, Iran was part of the Western alliance. It had a very friendly relationship with Israel. It had a very friendly relationship with Saudi Arabia. It was a close ally of the United States. Unfortunately, the United States over decades have shown that it's not a very good ally. So the moment the allies are getting into trouble, the United States actually, not only doesn't support them, actually work with the other side. But if this regime is gone, then you really will have a new order emerging in the Middle East. You will have peace, you will have prosperity, you will have a lot of economic relation between all these nations. So, because right now what you have the Islamic Republic that is supporting all kinds of terrorist groups, Shia, Sunnis, and they are actually in Latin America. They are in Africa. They have spent a lot of money in Nigeria. They have a lot of Islamic centers in Latin America. So this is a regime that's really trying to export terrorism, export revolution, and on Islamism side, the effect on Shia we know, but the effect on Sunni, many don't know. This is the first time that all these Islamist groups saw that you can actually be a radical Islamist and control the state. So this is a role model for everyone. This is a role model for Al-Qaeda. This is a role model for ISIS. So its fall actually not only helped the United States in its great powers competition, it actually helps a lot on the war on terror, because this is the headquarter of terrorism. It will be gone, and this has been the inspiring role model for all this terrorist group. If that inspiring role model is not anymore, the war on terror would be much more easier to fight.
Saeed, my last question, maybe it's a bit of a pushback into, I do subscribe to the idea that maybe if the regime falls, terrorism will also decrease, but we also hear the counter side, which is, the underlying motives are still there. Therefore, a new head of the snake will emerge, a new terrorist organization, a new radical organization. So don't you see that scenario also playing out, where we dismantle Hezbollah, we dismantle Hamas, Iran regime falls, will a new ISIS emerge, or do you see this like the last stepping stone towards longer-term peace in the region and in the world?
Look, we are not talking about the end of the world like the Fukuyama was saying, but so Nazism still exists, right? But there is no government that has the might of state to back Nazism and put it in in place. Communism still exists. A lot of people in academia and other places are communist. Mm-hmm. But you don't have Soviet Union to back all of them, put every communist intellectual as the head of a state in a country. Islamism will exist. Radical Islamism will exist. But if you don't have like these governments, this state, the key among them is really the Islamic Republic in Iran. If you don't have that, this government that has access to a country of 85 million people, a lot of resources, Iran naturally is the dominant force in that region, in the Persian Gulf. So now you have this dominant force backing a very dangerous ideology. So if it falls, that ideology will become, much more weaker. It will exist. Yes, it may emerge somewhere else. Who knows? Maybe they manage to overthrow Saudi Arabia at some point, and they emerge there. Who knows? But if they don't have the backing of a state, then they will be much weaker. Why is this? Why are the Sunni Islamists become so strong? Again, if you go back, one of the reasons that they became so strong, there were two reasons. One was the Saudis, after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, they were very afraid. They had to make a deal with their own Islamists. So we support you go outside, but don't do anything to us. The second one was the mistake that we made in Afghanistan. And we helped all these Islamists to go and fight with the Soviet Union. So these were like two events that made this Sunni Islamist very strong. Both of them had the backing of two states. One was Saudi Arabia, the other one was the United States. So if you don't have the backing of the state, it's very difficult for these ideologies to emerge. And even in Iraq, so in Iraq, it wasn't that, they themselves become so strong. Yes, the field was very ripe for that, but you had Syrians who were helping them a lot, and you had the Iranians who were helping them a lot, funding them. So again, the state is having the backing of the state is very important for every dangerous ideology. If they don't have it, they will exist, but they won't be as dangerous as before.
Wow, that's a great point, and I never thought about it that way. How the government, a central government, does play a role in the permeation of dangerous ideologies. One could argue. Saeed, you have an open invitation to the podcast. We will be monitoring your work. I will add information on your work as well as this situation still unfolds between Iran, Israel, the Middle East, all of what we discussed. You have an open invitation. I would love to host you again. There's a lot to cover, and hopefully, longer term speaking, your vision does come into fruition. I think it's a win for all of us, and the more we can shed a light on that vision of prosperity, the happier and honored I will be. So thank you for joining me, Saeed.
Thank you so much for having me.